In the dim glow of Hunter Ridge Air Base's briefing room, Lieutenant Eliza Grant stood alone, her eyes tracing the red line that crossed her name off the flight roster. At 28, she was a pilot without peer in the simulators. Her call sign Widow earned through a streak of virtual kills that left instructors speechless. Yet, to her squadron, she was a paper pilot, her brilliance dismissed as mere theory, untested in the crucible of combat. Her heart pounded as she stared at the mission plan she'd warned against. A plan flawed, vulnerable, and doomed to fail. Ignored and mocked, Eliza knew the sky was about to turn deadly. Would her foresight be enough to save her team? Or would the cost of their doubt be paid in fire and loss? Step into her story, a tale of grit, defiance, and a truth that burns brighter than the flames of battle. Lieutenant Eliza Grant, mocked as a paper pilot, excels in simulators, but is sidelined from combat at Hunter Ridge Air Base. Despite her warnings about a flawed mission plan, her tactical analysis is ignored. When enemy aircraft exploit the predicted vulnerabilities, the squadron is ambushed, communications jammed, and pilots fall. Defying orders, Eliza takes an F-15 using her rejected plan to eliminate 5 enemy jets in a breathtaking display of skill. Her actions save the mission. But who is this Widow? Can a dismissed strategist rewrite the rules of combat? The base awaits her landing, stunned. Love thrilling stories of underestimated heroes turning the tide? Subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales like Eliza's. Hit that button, join our community, and share your thoughts in the comments. Support us to keep delivering stories where silence speaks louder than doubt. Let's celebrate strategic brilliance together. Lieutenant Eliza Grant stood alone in the dim light of the briefing room at Hunter Ridge Air Base, her gaze locked on the whiteboard where the mission assignments were scrawled. 8 names filled the flight roster, each tied to a jet and a combat role, but hers was crossed out in red, a stark reminder of her place in the squadron's hierarchy. At 28, she was a pilot with no equal in the simulators. Her call sign, Widow, earned through a record-breaking streak of 5 consecutive kills. In the controlled chaos of virtual skies, her kill ratios were perfect, her tactical decisions flawless, her reaction times so sharp they left instructors speechless. But Hunter Ridge was a place where old-school rules reigned supreme. Combat experience was king, and Eliza had none. To the veteran pilots, she was just a paper pilot, her skills dismissed as the product of screens, not skies. Major Thompson's voice still echoed in her head, sharp and cutting. "Grant, you're on ground support today. Monitor communications, track radar contacts. Let the real pilots handle the flying." The words weren't cruel for cruelty's sake. They hurt because they ignored what she knew. For 3 nights, sleep had eluded her as she pored over intelligence reports on the Sierra Gulf sector. She'd mapped enemy movement patterns, analyzed their electronic warfare capabilities, and pinpointed their likely attack vectors. The mission plan the squadron was following had a fatal flaw, a blind spot in Sector 3 where enemy jammers could disrupt their communications and targeting systems, leaving the entire formation exposed. She'd seen it as clearly as a storm on the horizon, but no one would listen. The day before, in the tactical briefing, she'd stood up, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. "Sir, if I may," she'd said, pointing to the digital map on the screen, "this flight path leaves us vulnerable. If the enemy deploys electronic countermeasures here, our formation will be defenseless. I've drafted an alternative route that preserves our comms and strengthens our defensive position." Major Thompson, the squadron leader, hadn't even looked up from his coffee. "Lieutenant, that's simulator talk. Real combat doesn't follow your computer models. We know what we're doing." Captain Hayes, a 15-year veteran with a weathered face and a sharp tongue, had laughed outright. "Stick to what you know, Grant. Leave the real flying to those of us who've been shot at." The room had filled with chuckles, a wave of dismissal that drowned her out. Thompson had taken her meticulously prepared 27-page tactical analysis, hours of work, complete with threat assessments and contingency plans, and crumpled it into a ball, tossing it into the trash without a glance. Now, from the tower, Eliza watched the F-16s roll down the runway, their engines a low roar that vibrated in her chest. A familiar knot tightened in her stomach. Not fear for herself, but a deep, gnawing dread for the men in those jets. The mission was clear: intercept 5 unidentified aircraft that had violated restricted airspace. Intelligence suggested it was a probe, a test of their defensive response. But Eliza's analysis painted a darker picture. The timing, the approach vectors, the electronic signatures, they weren't random. This was a coordinated strike designed to exploit the very vulnerabilities she'd warned about. At her monitoring station, she pulled up the radar display. 8 green dots moved in perfect formation, following the standard intercept pattern. It was disciplined, professional, and exactly what the enemy expected. Her fingers drummed against the console, her mind racing through the alternative flight plan she'd crafted, now sitting useless on her tablet. 27 pages of detailed analysis, contingency routes, and defensive maneuvers, all ignored. As the green dots closed in on the unidentified aircraft, her pulse quickened. She could see it coming. The moment when the enemy's jammers would activate, the comms would go dark, and the squadron would be left blind. The veterans might mock her simulator skills, but Eliza knew the sky, not the one they flew in, but the one that lived in patterns and possibilities. And right now, those patterns were screaming that disaster was moments away. The airwaves buzzed with the familiar rhythm of routine check-ins, a symphony of confidence from pilots who had danced with the skies countless times. From the safety of Hunter Base, Lieutenant Eliza Grant, call sign Widow, sat hunched over the radar console, her eyes locked on the glowing green dots inching across the screen. Each dot represented a life, a friend, a teammate, and they were all heading toward a catastrophe she alone could foresee. At 28, Eliza was a prodigy in the simulator, her tactical acumen unmatched. Yet her peers branded her a paper pilot, a term that stung like a fresh wound. She muttered a quiet prayer under her breath, her heart pounding in the silent command center. The radio crackled with the casual bravado of men who believed they owned the sky, oblivious to the trap waiting to ensnare them. Tiger Flight, airborne and en route to Waypoint Alpha. Clear skies, no traffic, came the steady voice of Lieutenant Morrison, a pilot in the squadron. The chatter continued, light and playful, as if they were on a routine patrol rather than a mission teetering on the edge of disaster. Captain Hayes, a grizzled veteran with 15 years of flight time, couldn't resist a jab. "Hey, Widow, you scribbling all this in your little journal? Gotta document how real pilots get it done." Laughter rippled through the comms, a chorus of mockery that made Eliza's grip tighten around her coffee mug until her knuckles whitened. Major Thompson, the squadron leader, cut through the noise with a stern tone. "Keep it tight, gentlemen. But Hayes is right, Grant. Take notes. This is how it's done beyond your simulator screens." His words carried a dismissive edge, slicing through Eliza's resolve. She wanted to scream a warning about Sector 3, where her analysis had predicted an ambush, but protocol bound her to silence. Ground support didn't interrupt flight ops, especially not a paper pilot like her. On the radar, the 8 green dots of Tiger Flight pressed forward, blissfully unaware of the 5 red blips creeping in from the northwest. Eliza's stomach churned as she watched the enemy signals, masked by terrain and cloaked in electronic countermeasures, just as her report had warned. She'd spent weeks analyzing patterns, predicting this exact scenario, but Thompson had tossed her findings aside, calling them theoretical nonsense. Now her worst fears were unfolding in real time. "Contact, bearing 270, range unknown," Hayes reported, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "Got something on thermal, but radar's clean." Eliza's mind raced. That's the jamming, she thought, her pulse hammering. They're using electronic warfare to blind our systems while locking onto our planes. Tiger 2, confirm contact, Thompson ordered, his tone clipped. Negative on radar, came the reply. Thermals are fuzzy, might be a glitch or atmospheric distortion. Stay tight. Eliza's frustration boiled over. She couldn't stay silent any longer. Her fingers trembled as she keyed the microphone. Hunter Base to Tiger Flight, recommend I mediate evasive maneuvers. Multiple hostiles approaching from the northwest quadrant using electronic warfare. Static roared back, followed by Thompson's voice, sharp and venomous. Ground control, maintain radio discipline. We don't need your simulator fantasies right now. Her heart sank, but she pressed on. Sir, this isn't a scenario. My analysis. Grant, get off this frequency. That's an order. The line went dead, leaving only the hum of the command center and the relentless march of the red dots on her screen. Eliza's eyes burned as she watched the enemy close the gap. Less than a minute until they'd be in firing range. Her hand hovered over the secure phone, torn between protocol and the lives at stake. Then chaos erupted. Missiles inbound, multiple contacts. Hayes' voice cracked with the urgency. They came out of nowhere, break formation. Thompson's command followed, laced with panic. Evasive maneuvers, my targeting's down. Morrison's voice joined the fray, high-pitched and frantic. I can't get a lock, electronic warfare's active. Another pilot chimed in. Comms degrading, radars intermittent. Eliza's chest tightened as the radar painted a grim picture. The enemy had executed her predicted attack to perfection. The squadron's formation shattered, their advanced technology rendered useless by jamming and stealth. Tiger 4 is hit, a voice screamed. Tiger 4 going down. The radio became a cacophony of overlapping shouts, damage reports, desperate coordinates, futile attempts to regroup, all drowned in electronic interference. In the command center, Eliza watched helplessly as the disaster she'd foreseen unfolded. 4 green dots vanished from the screen, each loss a gut punch. The remaining F-16s were scattered across 50 miles of airspace, easy prey for an enemy that could see them while remaining invisible. Base, this is Tiger Lead. Thompson's voice broke through, strained and desperate. We need immediate support. Request backup aircraft. General Morrison, the base commander, responded over the emergency channel, his tone grim. Negative, Tiger Lead. All assets are committed. You're on your own. Eliza's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the dwindling signals on the radar, her mind replaying the report she'd written, the one no one had believed. In the corner of the room she sat, her heart heavy with the weight of lives lost in a truth she'd known all along but couldn't make them hear. Lieutenant Eliza Grant, callsign Wurubantuwadu, stood alone in the dim glow of the hangar, her eyes locked on the F-15 Eagle that sat poised on the tarmac, its sleek lines cutting through the night like a blade. At 28, she was a pilot whose skill in simulators was unmatched, yet her peers branded her a paper pilot, their mocking laughter dismissing her as untested in the crucible of real combat. Her tablet, clutched tightly, displayed a meticulously crafted tactical analysis, each marker pinpointing enemy aircraft with a precision her squadron refused to heed. Major Thompson, the grizzled squadron leader, had scoffed at her proposed offensive counterattack, favoring a defensive retreat that now lay in tatters. Captain Hayes, a 15-year veteran, had joined the chorus of derision, though a flicker of respect would later spark in his eyes. General Morrison, the base commander, would only see her worth after the mission's end. For now, Eliza stood alone, her heart pounding with a mix of defiance and certainty. The radio's static cut through her thoughts, delivering a gut-wrenching report. Tiger 6 is down. Repeat, Tiger 6 is down. Only 3 jets remained of the original 8, the squadron shredded by an ambush Eliza had warned against. Her fingers tightened around her helmet, her mind racing but resolute. This was no time for hesitation. Slipping past the distracted duty officers, she moved toward the F-15, its fueled and ready frame a silent promise of power. The maintenance chief was nowhere in sight, leaving the jet unguarded, as if fate itself had cleared her path. She climbed into the cockpit, her movements fluid, instinctive, honed by hundreds of simulator hours. Every switch, every gauge, every nuance of the F-15 systems was as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. The engine roared to life, its thunderous growl swallowing the wail of the base's emergency sirens. Unknown aircraft on taxiway Delta. Identify yourself immediately, the tower demanded, its tone sharp with alarm. Kier Radio Tower, this is Lieutenant Grant in Eagle 77, requesting I mediate emergency takeoff authorization, Eliza replied, her voice calm but unyielding. Negative, you are not authorized for flight operations, the controller snapped. Sir, I have tactical intelligence on enemy positions, she countered, urgency creeping into her tone. I can end this engagement. The response was immediate. Grant, return to parking immediately. That's a direct order. But Eliza was beyond orders now. She slammed the throttle forward, the F-15 lurching toward the runway. Security vehicles revved to life behind her, their lights flashing in futile pursuit, but she was already airborne, the jet's ascent a defiant declaration. In the cockpit, a serene focus enveloped her, the chaos below fading as her simulator training took over. She knew the enemy's positions, their attack patterns, their every move, knowledge her squadron had discarded, now her only weapon. The F-15 soared past 20,000 feet, its engines cutting through the electronic warfare interference that had crippled her squadron below. From this vantage, Eliza's radar painted a stark picture. 5 enemy aircraft, arrayed in a perfect ambush formation, exactly where her rejected analysis had predicted. They exploited the terrain and jamming to remain invisible to the F-16s, picking them off with ruthless efficiency. Eagle 77, this is Hunter Base, the tower controller's voice crackled, laced with fury. You are ordered to return to base immediately. Acknowledge. Eliza ignored the command, switching to the emergency frequency where the surviving pilot's desperate calls filled the air. Only 2 green dots blinked on her scope, Major Thompson and one other, weaving erratic paths, their comms jammed, their weapons compromised. Any Hunter aircraft? This is Tiger Lead. Thompson's voice broke through, stripped of its usual arrogance, raw with desperation. We need immediate assistance. Unknown number of hostiles, position uncertain, weapon systems compromised. For a fleeting moment, Eliza hesitated, the weight of her defiance pressing against her. They'd mocked her, dismissed her, thrown her plan into the trash. Yet here she was, the paper pilot, holding the only strategy that could save them. Her fingers tightened on the controls, her resolve hardening. She wasn't just fighting the enemy, she was fighting to prove that a discarded idea, a silenced voice, could rewrite the outcome of a battle. The F-15 systems hummed beneath her, ready to execute the plan her squadron had rejected. The battlefield stretched out before her, and in that moment, Eliza Grant knew she was no longer just a pilot. She was the sole survivor, the one who saw the danger coming when no one else would listen. Lieutenant Eliza Grant, call sign Widow, was a 28-year-old pilot whose prowess in simulator training was unmatched. Yet her peers branded her a paper pilot, a label that stung like a fresh wound. Her cockpit was her sanctuary, a place where she could prove herself beyond the dismissive whispers of the squadron. Major Thompson, the squadron leader, had no faith in her, brushing off her meticulously crafted tactical analyses as if they were mere scribbles. Captain Hayes, a grizzled 15-year veteran, had initially joined the chorus of mockery, his laughter echoing through the briefing room whenever Eliza spoke. But today, high above the jagged peaks and rolling valleys, the sky would be her judge, jury, and executioner. Eliza's fingers danced across the cockpit controls of her F-15, her eyes locked on the tactical display glowing before her. The plan she had laid out 3 days ago, the one Thompson had crumpled and tossed into the trash with a scoff, was now unfolding with chilling precision. Every enemy position, every attack vector, every vulnerability, she had mapped them all. The enemy pilots, seasoned professionals, moved like clockwork, adhering to a predictable pattern she had dissected in her analysis. They had positioned their aircraft to exploit the blind spots of the standard defensive formation, expecting to pick off the F-16s below like wolves among sheep. But Eliza wasn't flying by the book. She was rewriting it. The first enemy aircraft didn't stand a chance. Eliza dove from above, her F-15 slicing through the air at near supersonic speed, a predator unseen and unheard. The hostile pilot, fixated on the F-16s below, never registered the threat until it was too late. Eliza locked onto the lead aircraft with her AMRAAM missiles, her heart steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. Fox 3, she announced over the radio, her voice calm and measured, signaling the missile launch. A heartbeat later, the sky erupted in a fiery bloom as the enemy jet disintegrated. One down. The enemy formation, expecting an easy hunt, was thrown into disarray. Their prey wasn't scattered and vulnerable. They were being outmaneuvered by a lone F-15 that seemed to know their every move. The second hostile, sensing the tide turning, broke formation and dove toward the deck, seeking escape in the low terrain. But Eliza had seen this coming. It was right there in paragraph 12 of her discarded analysis, a move she had anticipated and countered in her mind 100 times. She had already positioned her jet to cut off the escape route, her instincts honed by countless hours in the simulator. Another missile streaked from her aircraft, painting the sky with a second explosion. Two down, the radio crackled with Major Thompson's voice, laced with confusion and a hint of desperation. "What the hell is going on up there? Who's shooting?" Eliza didn't respond. Words wouldn't sway him, only results would. The remaining three enemy aircraft finally pinpointed her position and turned to engage, their formation tightening like a noose. This was the crucible, the moment where her simulator training would either save her or betray her. 3-on-1 in a chaotic electronic warfare environment was a nightmare scenario, but Eliza had lived it in simulations hundreds of times. She knew the enemy missiles' range, their aircraft's turning radii, their acceleration limits. She knew their tactics better than they knew themselves. The third hostile fired first, launching two heat-seeking missiles from extreme range. Eliza's countermeasures flared, chaff and flares bursting into the sky as she executed a high G-turn, her body pressed into the seat, muscles straining. The maneuver burned into her muscle memory. The missiles streaked past, harmless. While the enemy pilot struggled to recover from his failed attack, Eliza was already in position. Her cannon roared, stitching a deadly line across the hostage Sudal's wing. The aircraft spiraled downward, trailing flames and smoke, a fiery comet meeting its end in the earth below. Three down. The AWACS surveillance aircraft, finally arriving on station, broke through the radio static. "Eagle 77, identify yourself. Confirm your status and mission." Eliza ignored the call, her focus razor-sharp. Two hostiles remained, and they were adapting, coordinating to trap her in a pincer movement. This was the most perilous moment, where a single misstep could end it all. But Eliza had planned for this too. She led the two remaining aircraft into a high-speed chase, diving into a narrow canyon she had memorized from satellite imagery during her mission prep. The terrain was her ally, its jagged walls and tight turns, a labyrinth she knew by heart. The enemy pilots, desperate for a kill, followed her into the trap, their radar systems scrambled by the canyon's interference, just as she had calculated. At the canyon's end, Eliza yanked her jet into a vertical climb, her F-15 screaming skyward. The pursuing aircraft, caught off guard, couldn't react in time. One pilot pulled up too late, his jet clipping the canyon rim and cartwheeling into the rocks in a fiery explosion. Four down. The final enemy pilot, now alone and outmatched, realized the futility of his situation. He broke off, climbing desperately toward friendly airspace, hoping to escape the relentless hunter on his tail. But Eliza had orchestrated this moment, the culmination of her tactical vision. She positioned herself perfectly, her last missile locking onto the fleeing aircraft from optimal range. There was nowhere left to run. The missile launched, streaking through the sky, and the final hostile erupted in a blaze of fire and debris. Five down. In the silence that followed, Eliza's breath steadied, her heart still pounding, but her mind clear. The sky was hers. Captain Hayes, who had once mocked her, would later speak of her with quiet respect, his earlier taunts replaced by admiration. General Morrison, the base commander, would acknowledge her triumph, her name no longer a footnote but a headline. Even Lieutenant Morrison, another pilot in the squadron, would recount the mission with awe and describing how Widow had turned the tide single-handedly. And Major Thompson, for all his skepticism, would have no choice but to face the truth. Eliza Grant was no paper pilot. She was a force of nature, and the sky had borne witness to her truth. The sky roared with the chaos of combat, a relentless cacophony of jet engines and missile lock warnings. Lieutenant Eliza Grant, callsign Widow, gripped the controls of her F-15, her heart pounding not with fear, but with the sharp clarity of purpose. At 28, she was a prodigy in the simulator, her tactical brilliance unmatched in virtual skies. Yet her peers had branded her a paper pilot, a title dripping with disdain, implying her skills were confined to screens and theory, not the brutal reality of aerial warfare. Now high above the jagged mountain peaks, with no terrain to shield her and no electronic countermeasures to lean on, she was proving them wrong. The enemy squadron had been relentless, their electronic jamming smothering communications, leaving the radio a mess of static and fragmented voices. One by one, her squadron's pilots had fallen, their jets reduced to fiery wreckage scattered across the unforgiving landscape. 5 enemy aircraft had been tearing through the formation, exploiting every misstep. But Eliza had seen it coming. 3 days ago, she'd presented a tactical plan, Delta 73 meticulously outlining enemy approach vectors, their electronic warfare capabilities, and the precise counterattack positions needed to outmaneuver them. The briefing room had dismissed it, Major Thompson's skeptical gaze and Captain Hayes's mocking chuckle burning into her memory. Simulator tricks, that they'd called it. Now, with the enemy's final jet erupting in a distant fireball, the silence that followed was deafening. Eliza's voice cut through the cleared frequencies, steady and composed. Hunter Base, this is Eaglekin, threat eliminated, 5 hostiles confirmed destroyed, returning to base. Her words hung in the air, met by a flood of overlapping responses, ground controllers, surviving pilots, and even the base commander's voice crackling with urgency. Everyone wanted to know who had just dismantled an entire enemy squadron single-handedly. Then came Major Thompson, his tone stripped of its usual arrogance, replaced by something softer, almost reverent. Eagle 77, this is Tiger Lead. Thanks for the assist. That was impressive flying. Eliza allowed herself a fleeting smile, her fingers still tight on the stick. Just following the tactical plan, Tiger Lead. The one briefed 3 days ago. A long pause followed, the weight of her words sinking in. Thompson's reply was quiet, almost humbled. Copy that, Eagle 77. Message received. As her F-15 descended toward Hunter Ridge, the base came into view, a sprawling complex nestled against the fading light of dusk. Emergency vehicles lined the runway, their red and blue lights pulsing like a heartbeat against the evening sky. Crowds of personnel, mechanics, pilots, and officers gathered outside hangars and control towers, their faces turned upward, waiting to see who would step out of the jet that had just rewritten the rules of aerial combat. Eliza had taken off as the ridiculed paper pilot, the simulator ace who didn't belong in a real dogfight. She was returning as the only one who'd anticipated the trap, prepared for it, and lived to tell the tale. Her rejected plan hadn't just saved the mission, it had saved lives, proving that the fiercest battles are often won in the mind long before they're fought in the sky. The F-15's wheels kissed the tarmac, and the reception awaiting her was unlike anything Eliza had ever seen. The runway was a sea of flashing lights, emergency vehicles parked in neat rows, their crews standing at attention. Ground personnel, pilots, and even senior officers had gathered in numbers that spoke of something extraordinary. As she taxied toward the parking area, Eliza spotted the base commander's staff cars speeding across the tarmac, trailed by a convoy of officers, their silhouettes sharp against the setting sun. She powered down the engine and sat for a moment in the cockpit, the weight of her achievement settling over her like a quiet tide. 5 enemy aircraft destroyed. Mission accomplished, squadron saved. Her tactical analysis, dismissed as theoretical nonsense, had been flawless. When she finally climbed down from the cockpit, an eerie hush fell over the crowd. These were men and women who'd watched the radar screens, listened to the radio chatter, and witnessed a feat that would echo through the base for years. General Morrison, the base commander, strode forward, his presence commanding yet tinged with unmistakable respect. Behind him was Major Thompson, his flight suit torn, his face etched with the exhaustion of a man who'd barely escaped the jaws of defeat. Lieutenant Grant, Morrison said, his voice formal but warm. Report. Eliza stood tall, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her. Sir, 5 hostile aircraft eliminated using tactical plan Delta 73. No friendly casualties after my engagement began. All objectives achieved. Morrison nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as he processed her words. The tactical plan submitted for review 3 days ago? He asked. Yes, sir, she replied. The one that identified enemy approach vectors, electronic warfare capabilities, and optimal counterattack positions. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a collective realization dawning. The paper pilot they'd scoffed at hadn't just been right, she'd been the only one prepared. Major Thompson stepped forward, his earlier swagger gone, replaced by a raw honesty that silenced the onlookers. Sir, if I may, he said, turning to Eliza. Lieutenant Grant tried to warn us. Her analysis was thorough, detailed. We should have listened. The admission hung heavy in the air, a rare moment of vulnerability from a man known for his unyielding pride. The crowd absorbed it in silence, the weight of his words sinking in, and General Morrison turned to his aide, his voice firm. I want that tactical analysis reviewed immediately by our top strategist. And I want a Lieutenant Grant as Lieutenant Eliza Grant, a 28-year-old pilot with the call sign Widow, had earned a reputation in the squadron not for her combat experience, but for her unmatched prowess in simulator training. Her peers, however, scoffed at her skills, branding her a paper pilot, a term dripping with condescension, implying her expertise was confined to theoretical exercises, untested in the crucible of real combat. Despite her meticulous tactical analyses, her suggestions were often ignored, dismissed as the work of someone who hadn't earned her stripes in the sky. Yet Eliza carried herself with quiet confidence, her mind a repository of strategies and scenarios, honed through countless hours of study and simulation. Major Thompson, the squadron leader, embodied the skepticism that shadowed Eliza's every move. A man of rigid tradition, he viewed her analyses with a dismissive eye, convinced that only seasoned pilots could offer insights worth considering. His disregard for her work was palpable, his tone often sharp when she dared to speak up in briefings. Captain Hayes, a grizzled veteran with 15 years of flight time, was no kinder. He'd once quipped that Eliza's simulator victories belonged in a video game, not a cockpit. His words stung, but Eliza buried her hurt beneath a steely resolve, her focus fixed on the bigger picture, the safety of her squadron. The turning point came during a tense briefing when the room fell silent after Eliza's soft but resolute voice cut through the discussion. Sir, she said, addressing General Morrison, the base commander, the analysis is already complete. It's been in the squadron file since Tuesday. Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The defensive protocols she'd painstakingly crafted could have prevented the near-disastrous engagement that had just unfolded. Had her colleagues bothered to read her work instead of tossing it aside, lives might not have been risked. The general's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in recognition of a missed opportunity. He turned to the assembled pilots, his voice firm. From this moment forward, every tactical submission will undergo a full strategic review, regardless of who submits it. And effective immediately, Lieutenant Grant will lead our tactical planning division. The room erupted in applause, but it wasn't the perfunctory clapping reserved for fleeting victories. It was the kind of ovation that signaled a shift, genuine respect for a pilot who had proven herself not through luck, but through skill forged in preparation. Eliza felt the weight of their acknowledgement, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and vindication. She had always known her worth, but now so did they. That evening, the squadron ready room buzzed with a different energy. Pilots who had once mocked her paper pilot status now crowded around her table, their questions about electronic warfare countermeasures and multi-threat tactics earnest and eager. Captain Hayes, the same man who had sneered at her hours earlier, slid into the seat across from her, his expression softened by newfound humility. Grant, he said, his voice gruff but sincere, I owe you an apology and a drink. Hell, I owe you dinner for the rest of my career. Eliza's lips curved into a small smile. Not necessary, she replied, her tone even. Just read the tactical briefings next time. Hayes let out a hearty laugh, not the mocking chuckle of before, but one laced with respect. He leaned closer, studying her with a glint of curiosity. You know what they're calling you now? The widow. Not because of simulators, but because when you engage, you leave widows behind. 3 weeks later, the Widowmaker protocol, born from Eliza's tactical brilliance, was adopted as standard training across every fighter squadron in the Air Force. Her classified analysis became mandatory reading for combat pilots. Her name no longer tied to simulators, but to 5 confirmed kills and the salvation of her squadron. Eliza's mind drifted back to the chaos of that 18-minute engagement, where her preparation had made all the difference. I didn't win because I flew better, she reflected. I won because I'd already seen every possibility before it unfolded. They called me a paper pilot like it was a slur. But paper is where battles are won. In the planning, the analysis, the careful dissection of an enemy's moves before they even make them. Those 3 sleepless nights she'd spent poring over intelligence reports had been grueling. Not driven by a need to prove herself, but by a haunting certainty of what was coming. She'd mapped out attack vectors, predicted timing, and decoded electronic warfare patterns, seeing the puzzle pieces where others saw only noise. When her plan was discarded, she hadn't felt anger, only dread. She knew exactly what awaited her squadron if her warnings went unheeded. But in the cockpit, her simulator-honed instincts had proven her right. Every scenario she'd practiced, every decision she'd rehearsed, every calculation she'd memorized, had converged in a flawless display of skill, proving that theory and practice were two sides of the same coin. Now young pilots studied her engagement frame by frame, dissecting her decisions, her positioning, her timing. They were learning the lessons she'd fought to prove. Preparation, when done right, trumps experience. Major Thompson, once her harshest critic, now visited her office every Tuesday, not to offer apologies, but to review tactical scenarios with someone whose judgment he'd come to trust implicitly. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a quiet humility born from being saved by the person he had underestimated. Captain Hayes, too, had changed. He often told anyone who would listen that he'd learned more about air combat in 5 minutes of watching Eliza's gun camera footage than in his 15 years of flying. But the real lesson, he admitted, wasn't about flying at all. It was about listening. The military had drilled into Eliza the importance of following orders, but that day had taught her something far greater: the power of standing firm in her truth, even when no one else believed it. Lieutenant Eliza Grant, a 28-year-old pilot with the call sign Widow, had always been a standout in the simulator, her reflexes sharp, her strategies flawless. Yet, to her squadron, she was just a paper pilot, a term spat with derision, implying her skills were confined to controlled environments, untested in the chaos of real combat. Their skepticism stung, but Eliza carried it quietly, her jaw tight, her focus sharper for it. She wasn't here to win their approval. She was here to fly, to think, to win. Major Thompson, the squadron leader, was a man hardened by years of command, his eyes perpetually narrowed with doubt when it came to Eliza. Her tactical analyses, meticulously crafted and backed by data, were often met with a dismissive grunt or a wave of his hand, as if her hours of study were childish scribbles. To him, she was an unproven variable, a risk he'd rather not take. His skepticism wasn't personal, it was procedural, rooted in his belief that real pilots were forged in the crucible of battle, not in the sterile glow of a simulator screen. Captain Hayes, a grizzled 15-year veteran with a laugh as rough as engine rumble, was no kinder at first. He'd lean back in briefings, arms crossed, tossing barbs about Eliza's simulator scores like they were darts aimed at her pride. "Paper pilot," he'd mutter, smirking to the others, his voice carrying just enough to ensure she heard. But beneath his mockery lay a flicker of curiosity, a grudging acknowledgement that her plans, though unorthodox, had a precision that couldn't be ignored forever. General Morrison, the base commander, was a distant figure, his presence looming like the shadow of a storm cloud. He rarely intervened in the squadron's dynamics, but his word was law and his silence was judgment. Eliza knew he was watching, weighing her worth, waiting for her to prove or falter. Lieutenant Morrison, no relation to the general, was another pilot in the squadron, steady and reliable, his voice calm over the comms during missions, a grounding force amid the chaos. For Eliza, the weight of their doubts was a constant pressure, like the G-forces she endured in the cockpit. She didn't argue or plead for their trust. Instead, she poured herself into preparation, studying radar patterns, enemy tactics, and mission logs until her eyes burned and her coffee went cold. She knew the truth. The most critical orders aren't always barked over a radio. Sometimes they're the ones you give yourself, the ones that demand you act when everyone else hesitates, when lives hang in the balance and protocol feels like a cage. That truth came alive one day, in a mission that unfolded with brutal clarity. 18 minutes, barely enough time to process, yet Eliza's mind was a steel trap, every move calculated months in advance. 5 enemy threats, each one a blip on her radar, each one a life-or-death puzzle. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't need Thompson's nod or Hayes's approval. She acted, her training and instincts merging into a seamless dance of precision. One by one, the threats vanished, neutralized with a speed and efficiency that left the comms silent. the kind of silence that screams louder than any explosion. When the dust settled, the radar data was locked away, classified, but the story wasn't. The squadron's perception of Widow shifted. The nickname, once a jab at her inexperience, now carried a different weight, a nod to the pilot who'd turned the tide, who'd seen what others missed. Captain Hayes no longer smirked. His nods were subtle but heavy with respect, his eyes meeting hers with a new understanding. Major Thompson's skepticism didn't vanish entirely, but his dismissals grew quieter, replaced by a grudging acknowledgement of her results. General Morrison, in his measured way, noted her success, his words brief but carrying the weight of validation. Eliza didn't crave their praise. She didn't need banners or medals pinned to her chest in some grand ceremony. What she needed was simpler, harder, for them to read her briefings, to value the analysis she'd poured her mind into, to see that the real fight begins long before the jets scream into the sky. It's in the late nights, the endless simulations, the mental battles where every variable is weighed and every outcome anticipated. When Thompson tossed her plan into the trash, it didn't make her wrong. It just meant she'd have to prove it right, and she did. 5 clean kills in 18 minutes, a testament to preparation meeting opportunity. The lesson wasn't in the classified data or the mission logs. It was in the silence that followed, the kind that speaks when actions outshine doubt. Eliza Grant, the widow, didn't need to shout her worth. She let her results do the talking, and they echoed louder than any parade ever could.